All right, Chapter 7, A Secret Life. All fellows of Cambridge University were required to become ministers in the Church of England after 7 years. So Newton was a fellow, and his time was almost up. So Cambridge kind of had this rule where all the teachers at the university, because the university was a part of the Church of England, they had to become ministers at the church. Well, this was kind of a problem for Newton because secretly he did not accept all the teachings of the church. So he didn't want to become a member or a minister of a church that he did not agree with. Newton was a Christian and was very serious about his religion, but he wasn't willing to just accept someone else's explanations about anything important. And the particular thing that he disagreed with the church on was the idea of the Holy Trinity. But in order to stay at Cambridge, Newton would have to swear that he accepted this idea. In order, that was part of becoming a minister, is he'd have to swear an oath. But he did not want to lie, which is pretty honorable of him, actually, if you think about it. I mean, he needed to keep his job, but he was not willing to lie about something that he believed was so important, and I would agree. So instead of having to deal with that, he thought, well, I'm just going to go to the head of the Church of England and see if I can kind of work something out. And who was the head of the Church of England? It was the king. If you remember back from our history unit, King and Henry VIII, long before Newton's time, had split from the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church would not let him divorce his current wife, Catherine Parr. So he created the Catholic Church and made himself in charge of it so that he could decide whether or not he would be allowed to divorce the woman he wanted to divorce. So Newton went to the head of the Church of England, which at the time was Charles II. Newton decided to talk with King Charles II about his issue since he was the head of the Church of England. So when he got there, he proposed that because he was a professor of mathematics, he should not have to become a minister. He said, listen, I'm a professor of math. That does not mean that I should have, it doesn't make sense that I should have to become a minister of the Church of England. I should be able to be a professor without having to do that as well. Now, luckily for Newton, King Charles II didn't really care much about that rule, and he was like, okay. So the king agreed with him, and Newton was allowed to stay at Cambridge without having to become a minister. So, problem solved. Now, just as he had a secret religious life, meaning he, secretly disagreed with the Church of England, he didn't want to go to the king and say, hey, I don't agree with this. He might have gotten in trouble. So instead, he tried to go about it a different way. But anyways, just as he had a secret religious life, Newton also had a secret scientific life. Behind closed doors, Newton put a ton of time into studying something called alchemy. Okay, not alchemy, but alchemy, like a hard K sound almost. Now, alchemy kind of reminds me of Harry Potter a little bit, in that it was part magic, part religion, and part science. Now, right off the bat, we tend to think, oh, how silly for a scientist to be involved in studying magic. But you have to understand that science at this time was still a very new concept. So there were a lot of things about science that seemed quote unquote magical because they didn't really know how to explain them. For example, in history, we talked a little bit, at least in my class, about how the sailors were kind of, freaked out about the compass because they didn't understand why the compass was able to move on its own. So a lot of sailors wouldn't use it because if they thought it was superstitious. Well, now, thanks to science, we can understand why that moves and explain why that's happening. But back then, they couldn't. So there were a lot of things similar to that where they couldn't quite understand how something happened. So a lot of it seemed kind of magical. So it wasn't that these scientists were just throwing, all logic and reason out the window, but a lot of the time they couldn't really tell what was science and what wasn't. Alchemists wanted to find something called the Philosopher's Stone, which they believed would turn other metals into gold. Now, I can't really confirm whether or not it looked like that picture on the left, but at least I guess that's kind of what I would think of it. But anyways, they also wanted to find the elixir of life. Now, an elixir is a kind of fancy word for a combination of like a liquid or a potion or a medicine almost. And this elixir of life was they believed it would grant immortality, meaning kind of non-human characteristics, by prolonging life and curing all diseases. Now, if you ask my uncle in Georgia what the elixir of life is, he would say it's a Coca-Cola. I might say it's vanilla iced coffee. But according to the alchemists, it was a kind of like a medicine almost that would cure all diseases and prolong life. Now, alchemists considered themselves to be special, much wiser than ordinary people, almost like a select group. And so automatically Newton kind of fit in. There are many reasons why people, or many reasons that people speculate why Newton studied alchemy, but nevertheless, he kept his studies to himself for a couple of reasons. Number one, that was kind of what all alchemists did. That was kind of part of the idea is they're privileged to be studying alchemy. Therefore, they kind of keep, not everyone is as privileged as they are, so they keep it to themselves. But also, we know that he wasn't big on sharing his thoughts anyway because he liked to be perfect. So after he died, the Royal Society, again, that kind of professional group of scientists we mentioned before, which prided itself on open communication among scientists, was extremely embarrassed to discover that Newton, who was a member of their, club kind of at one time, had written over 1 million words on alchemy in secret that basically went against the whole motto and mantra and purpose of their club. Now he may have already left the club by then, but at the same time, they were still considered like the professionals when it came to science. So to know that there was kind of something that there was a serious scientist who had made a lot of great discoveries, but still had kept all of this secret, they were a little embarrassed by that. So they deemed his writings unfit to be published, and they were not published until I want to say the book said 2004, but much, much, much later. Chapter 8, The Competition. After his fight with the Royal Society, Newton withdrew into himself, claiming he no longer wanted to study scientific things. Remember, working as a team didn't exactly work out for him, so he kind of went back to working by himself. So in 1684, three members of the Royal Society were chatting in a coffee house about current scientific issues. One was Robert Hooke, who is pictured on the left here, I believe. That was Newton's enemy. Then we have Edmund Halley, a young astronomer who should be the middle picture, and then Christopher Wren, a famous architect who should be the picture on the right. Now, here was a discussion. Wren had been trying to understand how and why the planets orbited the sun, and he asked the other men for help. What he was really trying to find was basically like a mathematical formula that you could follow to determine the path of planets around the sun. Wren challenged Hooke and Halley to prove that the inverse square rule would produce an elliptical orbit, or that kind of squished circle or oval shape. So here was the thought. The force between the planet and the sun changes faster as the distance between them grows. If they could find this relationship, have a mathematical formula for it, and prove it, they would have created an important new law about the way the planets moved. Okay, so here's just an example of that kind of elliptical orbit I was talking about. And the force between the planets kind of works like magnets. You know how the further you pull magnets apart from each other, the less force they have on each other. That's kind of similar to the way the planets are with the sun. The further they are from the sun, obviously, the less force there's between the two. And then the whole challenge was figuring out the mathematical equation for this. The first to be able to prove this law would be rewarded with a valuable book. That was like the prize. Now, Robert Hooke bragged that he had already done this, but he wasn't quite ready to tell the others how. He wanted them to try and fail first, and then he would show them. But after 2 months, he had produced nothing. So it seems like he was all talk and maybe never really actually was able to prove it. So nervously, Edmund Halley decided to approach the prickly Newton for help. Now, we're using that word prickly to describe his personality, basically. We know he was kind of a grumpy individual, wasn't always the most friendly, and maybe wouldn't be willing to help. So Halley was like, well, I guess I'm going to ask Newton, but he might blow up on me. We'll see. Now, when he asked him, Newton claimed that he also had been able to prove it before. He had done the work before, but he wasn't sure where he had put the proof, so he promised to send it to Halley as soon as he found it. Now, the difference between him and Hooke is this. Unlike Hooke, Newton was not just bragging, and within a few months, Newton was able to send Halley his proof, which I'm assuming helped Edmund Halley win the competition. So, tomorrow we'll go on to Chapter 9, Newton's Big Book.